Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, Boris Johnson has been accused of being dishonest about his reasons for suspending Parliament. And the accusation comes from none other than the former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major. His lawyer has told the Supreme Court that the only reason Mr Johnson wanted a longer than usual suspension was to stop MPs interfering in his Brexit plans. The government argues it is not a matter for the court at all. Our home editor, Mark Easton, reports.
Sir John Major, Boris Johnson. Two Conservative Party leaders, two Prime Ministers. But today the battle over Brexit saw them turn blue on blue amid accusations of hypocrisy, dirty tricks and lies. As the Supreme Court began the final day of its hearing into whether Mr Johnson unlawfully suspended or prorogued Parliament, Sir John Major told the judges in a written note that Boris Johnson had ulterior motives and his stated reasons for ending the parliamentary session could not be true. Sir John Major's lawyer in court, Lord Garnier, accused a Downing Street staffer of falsely suggesting that as Prime Minister, his client had suspended Parliament with ulterior motives.
And it was suggested that he had prorogued for base political reasons.
And the demonstrators are out on the streets again.
Mudslinging, it was suggested. There was nothing base and political about the decision to ask the Queen to shut Parliament down early ahead of the election in 1997. In the Cabinet at the time, Michael, now Lord Heseltine, today dismissed the idea as nonsense.
There is recent evidence of the Downing Street press office having been misleading in its announcements.
Lord Garnier also referred to a text sent to the BBC by a Downing Street source which said the claim that the government is considering proroguing Parliament in September in order to stop MPs debating Brexit is entirely false. It later emerged that ministers had discussed asking the Queen to suspend the session, although Number 10 maintains it wasn't to close down discussion on Brexit.
We are not concerned with when and how and on what terms the United Kingdom leaves the European Union.
Stressing their discussions have nothing to do with Brexit, the justices today received an answer to their own question to Number 10. What would government do if they lost the case?
Now, if the Supreme Court says the suspension of Parliament was unlawful, Downing Street are considering three options, depending on the exact reasons. One, they don't need to do anything at all. Two, they bring back Parliament, but they bring forward the Queen's speech. Or three, they immediately go back to the Queen again and ask her to suspend Parliament again, but this time lawfully.
This afternoon, the government lawyer, Lord Keane, argued it should never get that far anyway, because the judges have no right to rule on the matter.
The length of each session of Parliament and the frequency between sessions is regulated by constitutional convention and not by the law.
Remain campaigner Gina Miller's lawyer argued the outcome should be the immediate recall of MPs.
We would expect, in the light of a declaration, that the Prime Minister will ensure that Parliament resumes as soon as possible next week.
We will now consider carefully all the arguments which are being presented to us. But we also know that this case must be resolved as quickly as possible, and we hope to be able to publish our decision early next week.
If they follow past practice, the justices will come together in the next few days and each in turn will give their view, starting with the newest member of the Supreme Court and finishing with the President, Lady Hale. It is, as she said, a serious and difficult question of law. And for the world outside the courtroom, a question with profound implications for the great institutions of state, for our democracy, and for the citizens of a troubled kingdom. Mark Easton, BBC News, the Supreme Court.
Well, let's talk to our political editor, Laura Koonsberg. Laura, the Supreme Court is all about Boris Johnson's conduct of Brexit, and today I gather he says he's making progress.
That's right, George. I mean, aside from the court, which is just down the road from me, the other big focus in government right now is whether or not we will get a deal with the European Union or whether they have to prepare even more intensely for leaving without one. And there have been an awful lot of diplomatic flounces and fripperies in the last couple of weeks. But if we strip all of that away, just exactly what is going on? Well, there's a sense on this side of the channel, at least, that some of the bricks in that brick wall are at least starting to come loose. The The UK has now submitted a whole range of ideas to the European side that they hope could be the basis of a deal. And the EU has now acknowledged that's actually happened, rather than just saying, oh, we haven't seen any concrete proposals, the UK must tell us what they want. So there is now a sense of some movement. But if this is a journey of 100 miles, they've maybe travelled, you know, a mile or two in recent days. The Prime Minister seems to be not wanting to exaggerate the chances, but there is, though, a mood at least that things might be starting to move, at least a little bit.
Laura, thank you very much.
We shall find out early next week whether the Supreme Court believes that Boris Johnson broke the law and misled the Queen when he advised her to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks. The Prime Minister could be at the United Nations in New York when the justices rule on his actions. The extraordinary case ended today with former Conservative Prime Minister Sir John Major arguing that his successor had acted dishonestly. Whilst lawyers tussled over the basis of our constitution, outside the court, questions were still being asked about the progress of the Brexit negotiations themselves in Brussels. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this report.
Yet another election-style photo opportunity for the election Parliament refused to let him have. The Prime Minister was meeting troops in Wiltshire, while a predecessor in the office, Sir John Major, was sending his lawyer into the Supreme Court to accuse Boris Johnson of not telling the truth.
Sir John identifies various pieces of evidence which suggest that the decision was in fact motivated to a material extent by a desire to prevent Parliament from interfering with the Prime Minister's policies during that critical period.
Representing the government, Lord Keane said the court risked straying into politics if it passed judgment on the suspension of Parliament.
In my respectful submission, the applicants and the petitioners are inviting the courts into forbidden territory and into what is essentially a minefield, an ill-defined minefield.
The judges know some think they're trespassing on political decisions, and they warned one lawyer to stick to legal arguments.
And if the court will permit me, I'll make this point, that leaving with a no deal would be contrary to the terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
So many people are listening to you. Perhaps some of them have just turned on. And they will hear these points, these general points about Brexit and its effect on Northern Ireland, and it may come to an entirely the wrong conclusion, namely that this is what we are looking at. Now, don't abuse our politeness.
Back in Wiltshire, the Prime Minister told troops, "I'm hopeless with these drones. I always make them crash." Back in the Supreme Court, the justices wanted to know what he'd do if they decided he'd smashed convention and acted outside the law by suspending Parliament. The government's lawyers said he might do nothing. He might bring forward the Queen's speech in the next session of Parliament. He might just suspend Parliament again.
And it would then be essentially for Parliament and the executive in particular, to decide how to respond to that, considering the reasons that may be given by the court.
How would it then be that it would be for Parliament to decide how to respond? Because Parliament wouldn't be there.
Week. Thank you again, one and all. The court is now adjourned.
Thank you. The Supreme Court decision will come early next week, threatening a tumultuous distraction, just as the Prime Minister says his government could be close to pulling off a rewritten Brexit deal with the EU.
I don't want to exaggerate the progress that we are making, but we are making progress. And what we need to do, so people understand, we need to find a way whereby the UK can come out of the EU and really be able to do things differently, not remain under the control of the EU.
Yesterday, the Finnish Prime Minister, after a meeting with President Macron, said Britain must put a plan in writing within 10 days. Here, a government source said, "We'll do that when we're ready." The EU is saying it hasn't seen any proposals from the government. The government here is saying it has produced technical papers that kick around ideas. In the diplomatic jargon, they're called non-papers. They exist, but they don't commit. Craig Oliver was with David Cameron for his renegotiation of the UK's EU membership terms.
So the concern is that if you put forward a full proposal too early, it then gets put out there and lots of people are able to attack it and question it and tear it to pieces before it's even really got off the launch pad. Jeremy Hayward, who's the former Cabinet Secretary who sadly died recently, he always said you don't want to be in a situation where the rats get at it.
The deal the government seems to be sniffing around would require EU rules to apply in Northern Ireland, but not in the rest of the United Kingdom, on areas like agriculture, some other products too. But the EU believes their rules in these circumstances should apply across the whole board of products, and on areas like tariffs too. Both sides will have to stretch a long way from their established positions if there's to be a deal.
Well, not there yet. The gap between the two sides is really rather large at the moment. The British have not yet accepted that Northern Ireland would be aligned with the EU in more than a few areas like plant and animal health. The British have got to make a more generous offer and write it down on a bit of paper before anybody on the EU side takes them seriously. If they can write it down and make a serious offer, then I think the EU may well respond with something that isn't what the British are asking for, but moves in that direction.
If you were putting a percentage probability on this?
I said the chances of a deal before October the 31st, probably about 25% or 30%.
One source close to the talks said the only person putting the chances a lot higher than that is Boris Johnson himself, which could, the source said, reflect natural optimism or a bit of desperation.
That report by Gary Gibbon, magician and political editor.
Now, councils across the country are preparing for Brexit as the UK gets closer to the end of the October deadline. Within the last hour, the authority that deals with Greater Manchester has released details of its current plans. Our North of England correspondent Claire Fallon is in Manchester tonight. Claire?
Well, this document has, as you say, only been published in the last 40 minutes or so. The subject is Greater Manchester Brexit Preparations Update report, and it goes through some of the possible scenarios and what can be done to try and mitigate what it says are the risks, particularly if there were to be a no-deal Brexit. It says the Prime Minister has vowed to leave on the 31st of October, come what may, and says at the time of writing the national situation remains extremely uncertain. It says that if there were to be a no-deal exit from the EU, then they would try to put together a support package for any individuals who'd face the threat of redundancy and for businesses that were struggling if there were to be an economic downturn, as they put it. Talking about possible impacts on health and social care, they say that the reliance on EU workers in that sector is a particular risk in Greater Manchester. And they go on to say that the government has announced a UK shared prosperity fund, which would be to try and deal with the shortfall that would be created from some of the funds that currently parts of the UK get from the European Union. They say that the design and implementation timeline was expected to have been announced for some time, that they thought it would have been announced in the September spending round, but that no formal announcement was made, creating a risk that there will be delays to the fund coming on stream. So I think we can take it from that there is a dig at the Conservative government in there, and bear in mind the timing of the release of this document, with the Conservative Party coming to Manchester in just over a week's time for party conference.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire.